right? That Dallas Home song is one of my favorite songs. I believe that's in. Am I correct? It's one of my favorite songs that is there.
I knew this too. I didn't know what I heard.
I shared with you a little bit last week. It's amazing to think that 2019 is here. It's amazing to think that the last 380 some days, 70 some days has just gone by in the blink of an eye. It's amazing to think that when we get to eternity, it's not going to matter. And time is going to be no more. Well, I want to share with you, and I want to share with you as we begin this year, that my goal and my plan over the next 52 Sunday mornings is to share with you about living dangerously in the hands of God. And what that means is not to live recklessly, it's not to live carelessly, but it's to live righteously. It's to live trusting Him. It's to live following Him. Even in places which it may not seem like that we're supposed to be. Even and especially in places where it makes us very uncomfortable. But to remember that as we start out a new year, and if we as Christians across this world, if we are going to make an impact, if we are going to make a difference in our world, then we have to live dangerously in the hands of God. And this morning, I'm going to start this out by sharing with you about a person, a very, very familiar person whom you know from the Old Testament. We're going to talk about Moses. We're going to talk about Moses, a man who comes to mind to me first as I think of the Old Testament. A man who had a lot given to him once he was found in that river. A man whose parents were Amram and Jochebed. A man who was of the tribe of Levi. A man who was an Israelite. Yes, he was in captivity along with the rest of Israel in Egypt. But he was a man that I want to focus on this morning to see him live dangerously in the hands of God. A man who could have said, God, I'm not doing this. I've got everything. And let's face it, when you're found by the daughter of Pharaoh, you've got everything. And he refused. And we're going to talk about that this morning. But let's talk about this man Moses for just a moment. We're going to go all the way back to when he was first born. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 2, verse 2. And I want to share with you what the Bible tells us about Moses. In fact, what the Bible tells us about baby Moses. Listen to what it tells us. Again, in Exodus chapter 2, we're actually going to start in verse 1 and read down to verse 2. And it says this, And a man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And she saw, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Now I want you to underline that phrase, beautiful child. Because you see, what that phrase means is that Moses, when he was born, he was favored. He was a favored child. I did not say the favorite child, but the favored child. And that's what that word means. He was a beautiful child. And the Bible tells us that he was hidden, if you notice there. It tells us there that it was a beautiful child. She hid him 3 months. Why did she hide him 3 months? Because if you go back into chapter 1, if you go back there and you read that chapter, what you will find is a jealous Pharaoh. What you will find is a man insecure in his duties. You will find a man who was not quite sure how to handle the potential of having his authority challenged, and especially by outsiders. And he had his authority, as far as he was concerned, it was challenged by Israel. It was challenged by the fact that the Israelites were having more children than the Egyptians. And this scared him. And I want you to know something. It probably would have scared every single one of us if we were in his position. That your enemy all of a sudden, at least not your enemy, but your slaves, who the Bible tells us he was worried about joining his enemies to overthrow him, were getting more and more populated than they should have. So he made a decree He made a decree that the boys were to be killed. They were not to be alive. But if you notice something very interesting about that, the book in chapter 1, it also tells us that the midwives said, we can't get there quick enough. These Israelite women, they have their babies pretty quick and we can't get to them. So Moses, if you will, according to the Egyptian law that would have set down, the word spoken by Pharaoh slipped through the cracks. Not by accident. Why? Because he was a favored individual. He was favored by God. So we see this here. And if you would please understand what has to take place here. It tells us there, when she she hid him 3 months. If you go to verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dabbed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and lay it in the reeds by the river's bank. Thank goodness there was a family services back then there at this time, or she would have been in big trouble by the people, wouldn't she? What was she doing? She was doing everything possible to save her child from death. This is what she was doing. She was doing everything possible because she knew he was favored. She knew he was favored by God. She understood this. And she was and she took her son and she placed him in a basket. Now, I believe that God never does anything by accident. Okay? You are here this morning because God placed you to be here, planned for you to be here. And the weather outside didn't deter that. He understood that every place in life, if you're at home right now, he knew you'd be there this morning. He knew tomorrow you're going to go to. He knows everything about your life. He knows exactly where you're going to be. He knows your future. He knows my future. He knows the future of his church. And he knows the future of Moses. He knows the future of Moses. His mother understood that he was a favored child and that she had to protect him, just as any other mother or father would do. That he protected, that she was going to protect him from this edict, this unfair edict that was found. Now remember, God does nothing by accident. So go down with me to verse 5. And I want you to see what happens here. Verse 5 says, then the daughter of Pharaoh, I underline that because I think it's important. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. How many of you guys have seen the Ten Commandments movie? You guys ever see the Ten Commandments? It's pretty neat. But after really studying chapter 2, it's not even close. Okay? I mean, it's pretty close. It's accurate. I mean, there's some accuracies to it, but there's a lot of Hollywood involved, right? Well, there's no Hollywood involved here in Exodus chapter 2. And here we see the Pharaoh's daughter finding a Hebrew slave in the bushes in a basket in the river. Again, not by accident. God knew exactly this favored baby, this favorite child was going to be used for great things later on in his life. And you are here this morning, and God has a plan for you as well. God wants to use you. No, he is not going to use you and I to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. It's already happened. But he might use you in ways in which you've never thought about before if you are willing to live dangerously in his hands. If we as his church, if we are willing to live dangerously in his hands, then we will see things happen in his church like it never happened before. And so I'm telling you this morning that this in history, the events that we see Moses lead had never happened in history and will never happen again. Okay? We're going to see that now. We're going to see this take place. Now it tells us in verse 10, if you would go down, please. It says this: and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. You see, before then, what we read is that when they found Moses, they took him and his mother took care of him, nursed him and took care of him, and Pharaoh's daughter made sure she was compensated for it. Now he has grown, and now he is able to be brought before and given to Pharaoh's daughter. It says that and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Now, when you read your Bible, you ever notice that there's times in which you read a passage of Scripture, and all of a sudden the next passage that you read, it seems to skip some time? Okay? If you notice there in verse 10, if you notice there in verse 10 to verse 11, some time is going to pass. I'm going to read this to you. In verse 11 it says, "Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown," so he has gone from being a child, an infant child that we read about in verse 2, that he came and now he is grown up in verse 11. He has been raised within the system of the Egyptians. He was given the very best of everything that the world at that time had to offer. I am sure that he was able to read, he was able to write, he was able to do all kinds of things that the average person during this time frame of history were not capable of doing. So he has been given every opportunity to succeed according to worldly standards. He was given every opportunity to have the very best that was there. And Pharaoh's daughter was the one who did this. So he was able to have great things given to him. Now remember, God does not do things by accident. Moses was placed in this position because God knew years later that they would have to be led out by a man with a strong personality, a man who would trust God, and he knew Moses was the one to do it. So here we see Moses as he is an adult. We see him here. Now, I want you to read, I want you to notice something here. So he is grown up, and it tells us now at the end there in verse 11, "Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to see his brethren and looked at their burdens." Do you guys remember in the movie Moses that Moses doesn't find out that he's a Hebrew till later on? He knew he was a Hebrew. Right there in verse 11. He said he went out amongst his brethren. Not amongst the Egyptians, amongst his brethren. Okay? He went out amongst his brethren. What is he seeing? Remember, he's a privilege now. He's got everything. The brethren, the rest of the Israelites, what are they? They are slaves. Thusly, they are slaves, and everything about them is out of their control. When they literally can get up, when they can lie down, when they can eat, when they cannot eat, everything is within someone else's control. And Moses is on the other side, if you will, of the fence. That he is privileged. And he looks out with the heart of compassion. Okay, he looks out with the heart of compassion. When I think of Moses later on in the book of Exodus, he had a few times of anger, wouldn't you agree? He got a little bit of upset at times. But here we're seeing, in this passage, we're seeing a man who has a heart of compassion. A man who sees slaves in slavery, and something needs to be done. In fact, we're going to see how severe it got for him as he looks out amongst his brethren. It says there, and he saw an Egyptian, we're still there in verse 11, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. It says, so he looked this way and that way. Don't you love that he looked left? He looked right. He looked forwards. He looked backwards. He looked around, which tells me what? What he's getting ready to do, he knows he could potentially get in trouble for, but in reality he couldn't, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, or wouldn't, I should say. But the reality is here is he knows what he's getting ready to do, others are going to frown upon. And he's hoping nobody sees him do it. It's kind of like a 2-year-old hoping nobody sees them get into the cookie jar, okay? But the difference is here he's going to kill somebody. Little bit different than someone sneaking a cookie out of the cookie jar, but he's looking around and he's going to see if anybody notices his next step. And we all, if you've read this passage before, you heard the story of Moses before, we know his next step was murder. Okay? So look what it says here. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. See, there was the next dead giveaway. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He tried to hide his actions. Okay? Now, understand something. Over the years, I've heard so many people say, God can't use me. Listen, if God can use Moses to lead the children of Israel out of bondage and into the promised land, he can use you for anything. For anything. So here we see him going about this process. And again, he's trying to hide just that. So Moses, what he was doing, he knew was wrong, but yet he still did it. And I want you to notice a key phrase here, something else that's interesting. And it tells us there, if we move on to verse 13, it says, and when he went out the second day, so the next morning, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptians? Have you ever been caught before and you thought nobody saw you do it? Okay? Moses just got caught that he thought nobody saw him do it. Okay? Now, mind you, it's interesting here is that who caught him? A fellow brother. Right? An Israelite caught him. Do you think this Israelite was going to rat out Moses? No way. But Moses sure thought something bad was going to happen. You see, one of the things we have to remember, he is royalty. We've all heard this before. Oh, royalty never gets in trouble. They get away with murder, literally. Well, listen, Moses was going to get away with murder, okay? Moses was not going to be punished by Pharaoh for doing this deed. Because what he did was what he has royalty, and the odds are very, very strong that since he was privileged, that he was probably never going to have anything go wrong, have his life potentially killed. If you notice here what it says. It says, and when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. This is when the movie shows him trying to kill Moses because he killed the Egyptian, right? No, this is about politics. Okay? This is purely about politics. This is simply Moses did a deed, and now I can potentially get rid of a rival person, and I have justification to do so because he killed someone to do it. Okay? So what happens? He runs. Now remember, God has chosen Moses. He is favored by God. That God is still going to use Moses. Moses is going to flee for his life. Legitimately so. Moses is going to flee because Pharaoh is going to try to take him out. Pharaoh is going to try to take him out. It is believed that it is Thutmose III, who is the Pharaoh in charge here at this time. And it truly is more about politics, succession of power, than it is of anything else. Because Moses was privileged. And killing a lowly slave owner is not going to cause some of privilege to be chased down for their actions. He is going to be using that as an excuse to chase down Moses because of what he did. He's going to chase Moses down, or try to chase Moses down, because he didn't want any potential problems with this man. So he goes to the land of Midian. The land of Midian is present-day Saudi Arabia. So he went into an area, I don't know about you guys, I've seen pictures of it, but that's one of the last places I'd want to run to. Okay? But he had no choice. And by the way, since God is completely in control, God knew he was going to go to Midian. God knew he was going to run into his future father-in-law. God knew he was going to run into his future wife in Midian, did he not? So he went to Midian. So he went there, and the Bible tells us a couple of things. It tells us that he fled for his life. Then it goes on to verse 16 of chapter 2. It says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. So Moses, not by chance, he ended up right there where his future wife was going to be, where his future father-in-law's sheep were going to be. He is not there by accident. And so we can see, and we pick up the story, and we know that God uses Moses in a wonderful way. And then in chapter 3, I want you to see what happens. Time moves forward. And time moves forward, and Moses was saved by God. Moses now is going to be given a job. How many of you guys have ever actually truly looked at job descriptions before? They can be overwhelming. I mean, they really can be overwhelming. And it's always dangerous to put into a job description, other. Okay? You ever have a job description that says, and other? When we first moved to Alaska, part of our job description was, and other. What in the world does and other mean? It means whatever anybody else thinks you should do. Okay? It never should be put into a job description. I just want you to know that. Never. Because it's not fair to the person who is in that position. So God now is here with Moses. He has never left him. And we have moved forward now in time. God is speaking to Moses through a burning bush. God is speaking to him, and God is telling him that the place by which you stand is holy ground. But let's give Moses his job description, shall we? Let's look at it, all right? Now, mind you, this is a man who was privileged at one time, has now run for his life, is now living in Midian, and God speaks to him. Listen to what happens. It's in chapter 3, actually we're going to go back up to verse 7. It says, "And the Lord said, I have truly seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." Listen, God knows your sorrows as well. God pays attention to you. God pays attention to everything going on around us. God pays attention to the sorrows that are in our nation and in our world. He knows. He's understanding. The problem is that sometimes we don't think God moves fast enough to remove those sorrows from us. But he knows what's taking place in our life. So he is sharing with Moses, I'm aware of what's happening in Egypt. I'm aware of the oppression that is happening to the Israelites. But now he's going to say to Moses, I've got a job for you. Okay? Listen to what happens here in verse 8. "So I have come down to deliver them out of the land of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites." You see, Moses, I got a place I'm going to be sending the children of Israel. A place that is already occupied by other people. A place that is good. A place that has plenty of food, plenty of goodness in his country. And they say that Israel, if you've ever been there, and I have not, my brother Carlos, you have been there, that they say that Israel has some of the most fertile land in the Middle East for growing of grapes and so forth, as we remember back when Joshua and Caleb came back from the Promised Land. So he has shared with Moses, this is exactly what's going to happen. That I'm going to be leading my children back into the land by which I say they are to go. And if you notice if you go on, if you would please, we're going to go to verse 9. It says, "Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them." Now listen to what he says. Now verse 10. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to underline this. This is a completion of the job description. The first part is where the job was going to take place. Okay? The second part says this. "Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Twice he uses that word you. He's specifically looking at Moses and says, this is your job. This is what you are going to do. You are going to go before Pharaoh, who, by the way, is trying to kill you. Okay, who is looking at taking every possibility to take your life. That's why you left. And he says, and you are going to do this in your life, in the life of our church. God is saying to us, you need to do these things. He's not saying one of you or two of you. He is saying you are to do these things. And I want to encourage every one of us to understand, if we are going to make an impact on the Southport area and the Indianapolis area of Indiana, we have to do it together. We have to make sure we understand that we live dangerously in the hands of God. That means to live righteously. That means to trust God, even when something makes absolutely no sense. Even when we say to ourselves, I don't get it, God. So did God always give the instructions to everybody when he told them to do a job? No. He was pretty clear on what their job was. And then a lot of the other areas were open to interpretation, really. He told them to go. He didn't say how to go. Sometimes he told them exactly where to go, who to share with, how to share with. And God is saying to us, I believe as a church, as His people, guys, this is what I want you to do, and that is to change people's lives with my message. Okay? And we can't do it as one or two people. We have to do it as a church. We have to make sure we understand that we live dangerously together in the hands of God. That we trust God each and every day. Yes, there's going to be times in which we think this isn't going to happen. This is crazy. There's going to be times we're going to rub each other the wrong way. Well, guess what? When you read the Bible, both of those things happen. And you know what else the Bible tells me? That God took care of those things. We need to understand that if we are going to make an impact on the people around us, they're not going to walk through the door to do it. We have to go find them and bring them. And God wants us to make sure that we understand that we might be living in the land of the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and all these different groups of people who are very much entrenched in their ways. So you say, are you set in your ways? Okay, every one of us are set in our ways. Sometimes we want to admit that, sometimes we don't want to admit that. But we're all very much set in our ways. Even children are set in their ways. And boy, the last thing I want to do, the last thing you want to do is be uncomfortable in our life. That's why we're set in our ways. This is why nobody better sit in my recliner. I don't have one, but if I had one, nobody better. But I don't want to sit in that. Better sit in my way. We need to understand it's so important that we take God at His word. That we take God at His word and we trust God with His word. Moses said very simply here in just a few moments, I'm not going to read it, but I'll share with you it. God, I can't do it. Sounds great, God. Can't do it. Just simply can't do it. God, I don't know how to talk. God, did you forget the part? It's not here, but God, did you forget the part that He's trying to kill me? God, did you forget that part? No, God didn't forget that part. It didn't escape His thought at all. God, over the next several weeks and months that we serve God, nothing's going to escape God. Okay, nothing. He's going to know what we need, what we don't need, how we're going to get from point A to point B. He knows this. And it starts by living dangerously in the hands of God. That means living righteously for Him. And this is exactly what Moses was going to do. That doesn't mean we won't have reservations. It doesn't mean we won't have fears. It simply means that we have to take that step and do what God wants us to do by following after Him. So Moses has been given this edict. He's been given this directive. But I want you to know something. This is what he was been told. Now fast forward just a little bit here in chapter 3. Okay? Chapter 3, verse 22. I want you to see what happens here. Now remember, God has told Moses, this is what is going to be happening. This is where you're going to go. Moses came up with his excuses of who am I going to tell you? Who am I going to tell the children of Israel that you are? And he said, you're going to tell them I am who I am. But notice what happens here. Moses, and the conversation continues, and I want to read this whole verse to you in verse 22, because I want you to see that the assurance that Moses is given here in his life and in his duty and in his job. Okay? Listen to what he says. First of all, God's going through here and God is sharing with him what's going to happen. And then the end is going to come. And it says this, but every man shall ask of his neighbor. This is after all God is leading Moses to lead the children of Israel out. It says, namely, of her who dwells near her house, articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. Underline this last part. So you shall plunder the what? Egyptians. Listen, Moses, everything is going to be taken care of. This is what's going to happen. Why? Because I am who I am, is what God told Moses. I am who I am. And you're going to plunder them of their gold, of their silver, of everything that they have. Why? Because God is in control. Because God is the one that they are going to be serving and following after. Now, How is God going to come to this point? How is God going to get the children of Israel to this point? Remember, first and foremost, he has a person who is willing to live dangerously in his hands. He has a man who is willing to be righteous, to be right with God. Flawed? Absolutely. But willing to be used by God. So now we see him doing this. And as we know that God is the one who's going to lead the children of Israel out. But he always chooses to use you and to use me. Always chooses to use his children to do his work. Always. Does he have to? No. But he chooses to. So God's going to do some things here to change the Egyptian's mind. How many of you would say that sometimes it takes one or two or three times for something to happen before you learn something? Okay? All right? Before you realize, I probably shouldn't have done that, or I probably should have done this. Well, the children of Israel and Pharaoh were really not much different. Why? Because they're people. And I'm going to give a very quick overview of what God's going to do to Egypt to get their attention, to get them to understand. And you might know them as the plagues. And I want to take a moment. I'm just going to share with you. I'm just going to read to you these plagues that are going to take place. So first and foremost, the hardest thing, and there's two very difficult things here, I believe, that Moses had to do. One, he had to be willing to be used by God. That is not easy. It is not easy to be used by God. And the second thing that Moses had to do, he had to go face his fears. Okay? How many of you can honestly say that you have run from your fears? Right? We've all, at points in life, have run from our fears. How many of us can honestly say, I face my fears as much as possible? I hope we can raise our hand there as well. And Moses is going to have to face the fear that this guy, who he probably called Grandpa, because remember, he was taken up by who? The daughter of Pharaoh. So he was a man who was very aware of the inner circles. He understood how things work. He understood that if Pharaoh said it, it happened or it did not happen. So here he is. The second thing he has to face is going back before a man and back to a country by which he fled from. But he's going to do it anyway. Oh, and by the way, he's not going to come back with a great message. As you watch our country today, how many people do you honestly believe would say, if somebody stood up with a microphone and a megaphone and put it all over as much as possible on the media, who said, God is going to judge us and here's how he's going to do it? How many people do you really think would care? I'm going to tell you how many. 2 words. Slim or none. Because you see, we aren't much different today than Pharaoh was. Pharaoh had his God. Right? He had his gods. Americans, we have our gods. We're inundated by our gods. And it's really important that we understand that God will take every possible step to get our attention if necessary. And sometimes that doesn't mean it's very pleasant. And Moses here, God has got his attention. God says, I'm going to use you. Oh, by the way, Moses, in ways you didn't think I would. In ways you probably thought, hey, I left Egypt, I'm never going back to that place. Never going back. Well, what's he going to do? Well, you know the place. If you don't, I'll give you a list of them, okay? Moses has gone back before Pharaoh, and the Bible tells us that there's going to be a few plagues. There's going to be a plague of the water turning to blood. That is found in chapter 4. There's going to be frogs that are going to be going out and coming out and taking out things people don't like. How many of you guys like frogs? They're all right. I like frogs. They're kind of cool, but they can be really weird. How about toads? You know, there's a difference between a frog and a toad. You know, the big old wart things looking on a toad. You know, those do give you warts, right? Just remember that. That's what I was always told as a kid. All right, they don't, just so you know, okay? But think about this. This is going to be on a scale that's quite unbelievable. So we're going to have frogs that are going to take place there in chapter 7 is where I really should have shared with you about the plagues of the water turning to blood. And chapter 8 is where the frogs are going to come in and take place. And then lice is going to come. That just gives me this. I just want to scratch my head when I read that. How many of you ever heard somebody say, I have lice, and you wanted to start scratching your head as soon as somebody does that? Okay, so now we have the plague of lice that's going to take place. And also there in chapter 8, we're going to see the plague of flies. And we're going to see in chapter 9, we're going to see the livestock is going to be destroyed. We're also going to see in chapter 9 boils placed upon people's body. And in chapter 9, we're going to have hail that's going to come. And the plague of locusts in chapter 10 that is going to take place. And then we're going to see the 9th plague of darkness take place at the end of chapter 10. Then in chapter 11, we're going to see the death of the firstborn. And it was not until that point that the realization of what took place really truly hit many people. It was at that point that God took, and the children of Israel were going to be able to leave. And when I read to you about plundering the Egyptians took place, God was very clear on what was going to happen. So Moses was very much going to be used by God. But how exactly did God and how exactly did Moses live dangerously in the hands of God? How did he do it? I mean, some might say he didn't have a lot of choice. Come on, he went to the burning bush and God pretty much laid out before him, this is going to be your life. Well, God doesn't work that way. But I do believe when you and I truly have an encounter with God, we're going to say, yes, God, whatever you want me to do. And here we see him, we see that he had that encounter with God. We have that encounter with him. But I want us to remember this, that living dangerously for God does not mean without planning. It does not mean that we live without direction. It does not mean that we live without God leading the way. It's simply, and I want you to know something. I want you to think about Moses. Did Moses have direction from God? Absolutely. Did Moses have planning from God? Absolutely. Was Moses with God? Absolutely. And God doesn't change. And since God does not change, we will have God the same way that Moses did. And he may not lead us like he did Moses with the cloud and with the fire and all those other things, but I believe he will lead us. Okay, we have to simply follow that. We have to trust him with that. So what do we need to do in our lives? What does our church need to do? What do we need to do if we really want to make an impact on our community in the year 2019? What do we need to do? And it is very simply this. We need to live by serving God. We need to live by honoring God. We need to live by following God. And we need to be completely committed to him. If we can do those things, guys, there's no obstacle placed before us that God will not move out of the way. And God will move them out of the way if we allow him to do so. There's always going to be those times in our life which we might say, I don't know if we can do that. There might be times that maybe you're sitting there now thinking, well, I can't do that. I don't know if I can do all of those things. I can serve God, I can honor God, but boy, completely committed, that scares me. And guess what? It should. It should scare us. But at the same time, it should challenge us. Challenge us to understand that God who rose Jesus Christ from the dead has not changed. And the God who says that come out and be, when God said come out of there, Lazarus alive, he was alive, does not change. The same Jesus Christ who walked on water does not change. The same Jesus Christ who turned water into wine does not change. The same God who said let there be light and there was light does not change. And we still serve that same God that Moses served. And Moses did wonderful things, not because Moses was special, but Moses was willing to be used by God. That is the difference between you and me and Moses. We have to be willing to be used by God. And if we will be willing to be used by God, I promise you, great things will happen in your life and the life of his church. I guarantee it. And I can also guarantee you there's going to be some who say, we can't do it. Can't do it. You know what? Moses tried that excuse. Moses tried to say, God, I can't do it. Can't do it, God. I mean, let's face it. Moses also said a few things, but not necessarily with words. God, I'm a murderer. God, I killed somebody. We don't see those words in the scriptures, but we do know that people are going to say, they'll say, oh, God can't use that person because they're this way or they're that way. So Moses was a murderer. Moses was a doubter. He doubted God. He doubted God when he said, God, I don't know how to talk. God, I'm not quite sure how I can do these things. But what God wants from us, what God wants from his people, he wants to have you and I to have a devoted heart to him. There are going to be those times in which we question. There are going to be those times in which we say, this isn't going to work. How are we going to do this? Listen, that's what faith is all about. If we had all the answers to everything, we don't need faith. We don't need faith if that's the case. But that's what faith is all about. Trusting God even when circumstances don't make any sense. Listen, Moses argued with God. You ever argue with God? Unless you're like, I don't know, come on. Yeah, we all probably have. He argued with God. But yet God did what? Still going to use you. You know, Brother Jim, argue with you want to. I'm still going to use you. That's what God's going to say to him. Do you know what I'm still going to use you. Okay, and we need to remember that. If God use some of the according to worldly standards, very lowly people. In fact, Mary herself said, I'm the lowest of lowest. And God said, I don't care. You have a willing heart, and I will use you. That's what God wants from you. That's what God wants from me. That's what God wants from his church, is for us to say, God, you know what? Whatever you want me to do, however you want us to do it, God, I will make sure I serve you. Now listen, Moses had a temper, didn't he? Do you know why Moses didn't get in the promised land? Has anybody ever thought about that before? Because of his temper. Okay? Because of his temper. Listen, God can still use us despite who we are. God will still use us. And I want you to know something. If we think we're replaceable, I want you to look at Joshua. Because God said, I'm taking you, Moses, and God raised up somebody else and said, come on, let's go. And he used Joshua. He used many, many different people who use every one of us. He will do so in our lives. Are you willing? Am I willing? Is our church willing to say, God, however you want to use us, we'll live dangerously in your hands. God, however you want us to follow after you, we'll follow after you. Because I promise you this, the world around us needs to know that we care. Needs to know that the church is still viable. Needs to know that this church is still relevant in their life. But more importantly, needs to know that God wants to be in their life. And we have a challenge set before us by the Word of God. Not by me, not by any other preacher that walked the face of this earth, but by God himself. A challenge. It says, are you willing to follow after me? Are you willing to trust me? Are you willing to be this way? Moses was not perfect. I want to point it out once again. And none of us here this morning are perfect. But every single one of us, man, woman, and child, if we are willing, we will be used by God. If we're willing, God will use us. If he isn't, listen, God is able. God is beyond able. God is beyond willing to use us. But are we? Are we willing to do just that? Moses, the Bible tells us this, though. And I'm not going to read this, but you can read this chapter. I'll give this to you. Deuteronomy chapter 34. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, it very simply tells us this in a one sentence, if possible, statement. That Moses, despite the fact that he was not perfect, despite the fact that he was apprehensive about being used by God, the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 34 this: despite those things, Moses died full of grace, full of favor with God, because he got up more times than he fell down. He had problems. You and I have problems. But the question is, are we willing to get back up and stay there? Moses did. And wow, did he make a difference. So I want to ask you this question very simply. What about you? What What about our church? I think it's pretty clear here in the examples of Moses that if we're willing to be used by God, anything can happen. I mean, let's face it, who would have thought one person? Who would have thought one person from the tribe of Levi could have led millions of people out of Egypt? Who would have thought that? Not Moses. I guarantee you, the whole time Moses was growing up, he didn't really think about that. But God finally intervened, didn't he? And God said, as he was out there walking amongst his people, he realized there was a problem. I'm going to share with you very shortly about Nehemiah, who realized there was a problem, so let's fix it. You see, we need to understand that God wants you and I to live for him. Are we as a church in the year 2019 and beyond, are we willing to be used by God? Moses lived dangerously in his hand. And I believe God still wants us to live the same today. But remember, it's not about recklessness. It's about being right with God. What steps do you need to make this morning to make that happen? Brother Donnie, would you come? Will you trust him with any decision right where you're sitting?